the frustration of the FCC during the last administration was that they did not say to American companies, hey, these protections are in place, let's make sure that we use them. Let alone, hey, we know there are other things that can be doing, such as the framework developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and you need to be doing those as well.
I'm Stephanie Pell, and this is the Lawfare podcast, December 22nd, 2022. Fifth generation, or 5G technology, promises to bring high-speed, low-latency wireless infrastructure necessary for the smart era. But moving from the promise of 5G to a reality where 5G networks will deliver amazing and important new capabilities and services will require those networks to be secure. To talk about 5G cybersecurity challenges, I sat down with Tom Wheeler, visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, and Admiral David Simpson, professor at Virginia Tech and former chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the FCC. They just published a new paper entitled 5G is Smart, Now Let's Make It Secure. We talked about the 5G cyber paradox, 3 specific cybersecurity challenges they outline in the paper, and recommendations they make for addressing these cybersecurity challenges going forward. It's the Lawfare podcast, December 22nd. Tom Wheeler and Dave Simpson on making 5G secure. Tom and Dave, you've recently published a paper entitled 5G is Smart, Now Let's Make It Secure. To begin with, how should we understand and think about the significance of 5G, especially in comparison to 4G? What makes it special, and what kinds of new capabilities and opportunities does it offer?
Well, Stephanie, 4G was a great revolution, and it opened the smartphone world to all kinds of new applications that we today can't imagine how we ever lived without. What 5G does is to move beyond the device in your hand or in your pocket or purse to make everything else smart and to allow the future of smart cities, smart factories, smart cars, and take advantage of the fact that computer chips have become so small and so inexpensive that they are in everything, and that the value of them being in everything comes from the fact that they can all be interconnected and controlled to deliver a whole new generation of services that shortly we will not understand how we are able to live without that either.
It really shifts from an emphasis around the smartphone as the principal consumer utilization of 4G and before to a machine-to-machine interaction between these devices at the edge of wireless networks that really are made possible through the convergence of communications, compute, storage, and the instructions that can take advantage of that convergence at the edge. And that's what brings in this, in the military, we're calling it sense, make sense, and act. The ability to bring machine learning and AI into the community so that the sensors that make up infrastructure, what was physical infrastructure, is smarter and anticipatory and can do wonderful things at the edge from that convergence.
I've heard the two of you describe yourselves as 5G evangelists, but you're also realists, which leads me to ask, why did you write this paper?
Oh, that's a simple answer, Stephanie. I think Dave and I both believe that success of the 5G promise depends on its security. That if you can't rely on the information being delivered securely, that there is less of an interest in using it in the first place, and thereby having a negative impact on the kind of promises we were talking about a minute ago.
I would agree and add that it's because we're so excited about the promise of 5G. I mean, the ability to anticipate and reduce risk in our lives, to bring in new functionalities to both citizens, consumers, businesses, it really underpins a competitive advantage for the United States that is very personal for a citizen, builds up to communities, ultimately to companies. But that if we don't recognize the software orientation of the network itself and its exposure, increased exposure to cyber attack, then we will not only when we get there have risks that we could have avoided, but it will take us longer to get there because the venture capital that should be coming off the sidelines to create this demand signal for these machine-to-machine capabilities will not manifest itself and will be later in getting to something that the rest of the world has a different approach to those risks and could get there before us and beat us to the competitive advantage.
I want to talk about the cybersecurity challenges that 5G brings with it. Can you start by talking about what you call in your paper the 5G cyber paradox?
Well, Stephanie, the secret to the wondrous capabilities that 5G promises is that it is software based, and therefore the ability to do so many more things better than the old hardware based networks of the past. And the paradox is that the software which creates these incredible capabilities is precisely the vulnerability. And we point out that it takes a vulnerability in two forms. The first is that we all know software is hackable. So that's just point one in the discussion here is how do we secure something that is proven to be insecure software? And then the second is that the industry has implemented this software in such a way that opens the market for more suppliers of the capabilities than the traditional telecom network suppliers. And that when you open the aperture of suppliers, you open the aperture to attacks as well. You just create more attack vectors to the system. So it is the nature that allows its great capabilities that also turns around and paradoxically has created its exposures.
So focusing a little bit on what you say the cold reality is that software can be hacked. How should we be thinking about this 5G vulnerability with respect to some of our most capable adversaries like Russia and China?
First, we shouldn't fear going to 5G, right? I mean, a lot of these risks you don't address until you build out and experiment and figure out, well, how is it being exploited? And then iterate through the mitigations for those exploitation vectors. So let's not be cowed into a bunker mentality. Second, let's recognize that China has had a head start, if you will, at applying not so much the scientific or early parts of research around 5G. There's been lots of academic and engineering work done in the United States about 5G. But China early on recognized that this took coordination between the academics, the engineers, the companies that would build these systems, the companies that would operate these systems, and then out into the communities, the regions and the cities that will be bringing the smart aspects of machine learning and AI together through this increased wireless edge. And they've got a different approach to governance. We know that in an autocratic nation, it's much easier to determine who's responsible for what and define risk ownership. Similarly, in Europe, Europe has been working on the same challenge, and through their regulatory body, through their industry associations, GSMA, they've been working iteratively with the companies that are European and leaders in this area, Nokia and Ericsson, on how to address risk. We have been averse to having a government engage directly in the market to determine risk ownership, and have wanted to, one, make the leapfrog towards software-based because we perceive that to be an advantage and how we might catch up with China and play to our strengths and our Silicon Valley culture and history. But at the same time, we didn't fully recognize that creating a demand signal in the market for using these systems was dependent on addressing the risk factors associated with deployment. And it's really that area that we seek to highlight, is to get that demand signal confident, or that demand signal going through confidence in the deployment of software-defined networks associated with 5G.
And in terms of the U.S. focus on the vulnerabilities, they're both the executive and legislative branches have at times focused on eliminating Huawei, a Chinese company, 5G network hardware from our networks. In your view, has that obscured some of the other broader security challenges that result from 5G's substitution of software for hardware?
Well, Stephanie, I think that's really one of the things that prompted Dave and I to pick up the pencil in the first place. In 2019, we wrote an article for Brookings in which we talked about the Trump administration's focus on the security of Huawei networks, while worthwhile and important, was focusing on hardware at the very time when, as we have discussed a few moments ago, hardware is becoming less and less relevant. And so one of the reasons that we wrote this piece was to talk about, as Dave was just talking about, how if we want to be leaders in the 5G world, the United States is going to have to be responsive to these demand signals, to creating these demand signals that Dave was talking about. The Congress passed the Wireless Infrastructure Fund as a part of the CHIPS bill, which was $1 billion, that's with a B, and a half dollars, to help promote R&D for American companies to be able to be leaders in the 5G future. And our point is that if you're going to be leaders in that 5G future, you need to be leading with secure solutions. And fortunately, the spending part of that $1.5 billion on enhancing the development of secure solutions is permitted under the legislation.
Yeah, and I would add that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, cyber criminals are absolutely capable of attacking U.S. equipment and a U.S. supply chain, and maybe even have a greater incentive to attack via those vectors than just their own hardware. That said, the hyper-focus on Huawei in the 2018-2019 timeframe really sucked the oxygen out of the rest of the cyber challenge. And there was such a focus on rip and replace, and people were equating that with, well, that's how we make it cyber secure. Well, I would note that rip and replace has been ineffective. We haven't ripped, we haven't replaced. There's still significant Huawei and ZTE equipment in the wireless infrastructure across the United States. Now, the policies are in place so that when it does get replaced, the hardware won't be there. But the greatest concern that I think Tom and I had when we wrote the first paper was what led to the corporate decisions to use that equipment in the first place. And in many cases, lack of an effective cybersecurity program within those companies led them to not even consider supply chain risk, to not have CISOs for their companies. There's over 1,000 wireless service providers across the United States, and we tend to think of the top 3, and then when you get beyond that, you can't mention too many. But these are all interconnected, and it is so important that we expect really a degree of cyber competence for any interconnected service provider for these wireless broadband capabilities.
That's a really good point that Dave just made. That's worthy of emphasis, and that is that we're talking about an interconnected set of different networks owned by different companies. And so what one company does can affect everybody else. So the message about the importance of having 5G cybersecurity is something that applies not just to the big folks who you're always seeing their advertisements on television, but to everybody. And even the big folks can be affected by what the little folks in small rural areas are, how they are behaving in their cybersecurity activities.
So, Tom, it seems that you're saying on the one hand that in some respects, the 5G substitution of software for hardware is going to allow for supplier diversity in a way that we just didn't have before. But that supplier diversity is not necessarily synonymous with cybersecurity. Am I understanding you correctly?
I think you just hit the nail on the head, Stephanie. When we were defining cybersecurity as, oh my goodness, you can't allow Huawei or ZTE equipment into your networks, then let's have a diversity of suppliers was a logical response. The software that is 5G enables that kind of diversity of suppliers. But as we say in the paper, it's a mistake to say that supplier diversity is the same as cybersecurity, because each of those suppliers and the suppliers to those suppliers themselves represent a new potential attack vector, which, as Dave said a moment ago, nation states and criminals are hard at work to try and take advantage of.
Stephanie, diversity, supplier diversity is a wonderful thing. And when you have more choices in a market, you typically can get better results over time from that market. But there are areas where that diversity breaks down and our negative externalities are there. And cybersecurity is one of those areas. If the diversity was to lead to better cybersecurity, it would mean at the point of sale, one could make an intelligent decision around the value of cybersecurity to a service that you're providing, or a consumer could make that. It is really hard to have a consumer assess in a meaningful way the cybersecurity of a given company. Some of our best, our iconic software companies that work every day at cybersecurity still get attacked successfully. We just think of Microsoft and Apple, and you work your way out to the edge for so much of the software today that fuels our information economy, and they've all been successfully attacked. So to have supply chain diversity and more entrance into this market, smaller companies enter this market, if at the point of sale one can't make a differentiation into the effectiveness of one cyber program over another cyber program, it's just not something the market itself is going to resolve to the level of satisfaction that as a society we want and should expect.
The topic of interoperability should also be mentioned in a discussion about supplier diversity and multi-sourced infrastructure, correct? So that leads me to ask you about the Open Radio Access Network Protocol, more commonly known as the ORAN. So what is the ORAN, and how does it further exacerbate 5G security risks?
So this is part of the exciting part, right? I mean, standards, when they're done well, will increase supply chain diversity in a way that is very helpful, right? The standards define interoperability so that you can connect one company's provision of the core within 5G to another company's distributed unit, to another company's radio unit, all controlled by a fourth company's radio intelligent controller, and maybe a fifth company's management of the cloud at the edge or the multi-access edge computing. So those are really good things. And within the open source standards for what's referred to as ORAN, there's an excellent working group 11, that is developing implementation guidance to ensure that those interoperability standards mean that you can not only connect those different layers, but that you can improve security end to end across that effort, across the different layers. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the ORAN Alliance, their implementation guidance isn't required. There's nothing that penalizes a company that implements in a different manner or keeps something proprietary or just chooses not to put into place a more costly element of it. And that the companies that make up the ORAN Alliance come from countries all around the world. So where we thought we would have a real national advantage in moving to software-defined networks through ORAN has turned out into an area where software coders around the world are playing a significant role, including China and other places around the world that we might perceive to increase the risk of our implementation.
So you identify a third area of vulnerability in your paper. You say that there is an absence of meaningful oversight of 5G standards and ORAN protocols. Specifically, you say there is no comprehensive identification and assignment of risk responsibilities inherent in end-to-end 5G services as diverse as the Internet of Things, smart cities, robotics, and industrial automation. And as I understand it, based on actions taken by the FCC in the last administration, the 5G security standards that do exist, and Dave, you sort of hinted at this in your last answer, are only voluntary. Can you talk more about these concerns?
Yeah, well, I think Dave just put his finger on it, as you point out, Stephanie, that let's start with the 5G standard itself. It has security improvements over the 4G standard. But those improvements are entirely voluntary as to whether or not the wireless companies put them into practice. And then you go to the broader issue that Dave was just talking about insofar as O-RAN. And O-RAN is also, well, here is a model of how things can be done, but you don't necessarily have to do it that way. And the frustration of the FCC during the last administration was that they did not say to American companies, hey, these protections are in place. Let's make sure that we use them, let alone, hey, we know there are other things that can be doing, such as the framework developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and you need to be doing those as well. And instead, they just had let's just, laissez-faire. You can decide what you want to do. And that leads us back to the point I was making a minute ago, which is that because these networks are interconnected, poor cyber hygiene in one network can undo the good cyber hygiene in others.
And neither Tom or I are at all suggesting that the government should be in the middle of defining the specific technical standards themselves. What we're really suggesting here is that the government should make clear that cybersecurity is an essential part of this particular critical infrastructure market. It's the foundation for so many other critical infrastructure verticals that we really need to build this from strength. And that in ensuring that there is a clear expectation that cybersecurity is a duty of care for the companies that seek to build equipment or sell services in this particular critical infrastructure vertical, that they anticipate how their service or their systems might be attacked, and in a proactive way work within their own companies and work with their competitors and their partners in the industry to themselves develop the specific technical mitigations to address those risks. But those risks need to be addressed, and that the agile introduction of new capabilities, new functions, as well as the agile response from cyber threat actors would suggest then that those charged with government oversight have a regular, a frequent interaction with the industry to have a collaborative view of this risk space. And the responsibility of those charged with oversight is to spot that risk, to admire when the industry self-addresses that risk, to call out when they don't, and if after calling out unaddressed risk, it is still not addressed, to represent the equities of consumers and communities, to provide incentives or need be subsidies to address the risk in the seams, the risk that winds up being a traditional commons.
So that leads me to observe that in your paper, while you paint a dire security picture, there is a bright side. You say that we know what to do, that the efforts, for example, of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency and NIST to address cyber risk illustrate that our cyber professionals know what to do. So we're not starting from scratch here. And to move things forward, you make 4 specific recommendations in your paper. And I'd like to talk through each of those. And so, Tom or Dave, pick your favorite one to start and tell us about it, please.
Well, let's back up for a second and before we get down into each of those and have the 30,000 foot view for a second here, Stephanie. And that is that it is important to view the cybersecurity challenge as a management challenge more than a technical challenge. Okay, that it is not necessary to go out and invent new technology to solve problems, but it is necessary to put in place practices using ever-evolving technology that can assure ever-evolving cybersecurity. And then I'll go to the first of the four, and Dave can do the next one. We'll just play tag team here. But that means that, as we've been saying throughout here, that everybody needs to have that kind of management focus and management discipline. That because all of the networks connect, as I've said before, the weakest link cannot be allowed to define the cybersecurity of the network. So the first thing that has to happen is an understanding that these management practices are applicable in every single one of the interconnected networks, regardless of who they are owned by.
Well, as we tick off the four, and Tom outlined the first, right? Companies must recognize and be held responsible for a new cyber duty of care, that they anticipate how their products and services might be exploited, and work with their colleagues to address ahead of attack. In Stephanie, you worked at West Point for a couple of years, right? Up at West Point, when we were working with the challenge of improvised explosive devices, we would talk about to the right of the boom after the explosion would happen. That's not a very satisfying part of the kill chain, if you will, to be focusing on. We really want to move to the left of the boom and anticipate how systems could be attacked. And that leads to the second piece, where we think that government should establish a new cyber regulatory paradigm that is as agile as the industry it is charged to oversee, and that there be professionals at the regulatory agencies that are able to communicate in the right technical details, not only with the industry, but with the professionals at DHS and CISA, with US Cybercom, and regularly ready to go into the details of how these systems and services might be attacked. But to focus on their part of this, which is really recognizing where the market isn't naturally incenting the closure of those risk gaps. And in recognizing the market shortcomings, really do so in a way that first tries to get the market to be more effective in closing the shortcomings, and doing that through consumer transparency, sharing information about when companies were attacked and what was done to improve for the next attack, to have a device focus and look at, well, what do we connect to these networks? While we were at the FCC, we did a notice of inquiry around, well, shouldn't we be defining some best practice hygiene around devices and having the device community communicate in a way that can allow the market to help drive the right kind of outcomes that we want. To recognize that the trickle down of, well, let's just do this well in DoD and federal agencies and through our increased obligations of contracts, that sooner or later others will see that and respond appropriately. That trickle down approach hasn't worked. It has created a smaller defense industrial base as we put more barriers to be an innovative company in that space, and caused others to say, well, I'm not going to compete there. I'm just going to sell in the open market. And finally, to work where the gaps aren't being addressed, to incent through subsidies the areas that are truly a market commons, that part that is not a single responsibility of a given 5G layer or 5G company, but really should have the end-to-end ecosystem coming together around risk reduction that will benefit all.
So you talked about our 4 points. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4 real fast here, just to recap for the listeners. First point, it has to be uniform and cover all networks and it needs to be at the network level, because the weakest link problem of networks. Secondly, that since we know what to do, we need to expect that it gets done and have a requirement and an expectation that it gets done. Thirdly, we need to have an inspect of that expect with light touch oversight by a regulatory agency. As Dave appropriately says, it's agile in its approach and light touch, so that we know that the things that we know need to be done are being done and are being done by everybody. So that's 3 of the 4 going backwards up the stack. And then last, because this is a national security issue, because this affects all networks in the United States, because we have made it a national policy that we will make sure that everybody has access to high-speed broadband, we need to also make sure that the American government is willing to step up and pay whatever that additional price may be, so that we can't afford it is not an excuse. We know what to do. We know that it needs to be expected. We know it has to apply to everybody. We know it's a national priority that deserves national funding. And that's the package.
I would note that you, throughout the paper, talk about this as a whole of networks challenge. And so just to reiterate your last point, the statement, well, we can't afford it, is just not an answer we can afford with respect to the challenges that you've identified.
Yes, Americans across the country have voted, they've communicated that access to broadband and access to broadband to include wireless is an expected universal service across the country. We want it to be there so that our kids can be competitive in school with their research. We want it to be there to improve public safety outcomes and reduce risk in communities. We want it to be there so we can bring small businesses and medium and large businesses out to the heartland of the United States and have them be competitive wherever people choose to live. We want that universal service for broadband access to be a competitive advantage, not just in our own lives, but in the whole of nation around global markets. So in accepting the universal service goal, that we should recognize that if it's not secure, it won't have achieved its value proposition. We do know what to do here. We do have the world's best cyber professionals. And if we approach this universal service expectation with the aspect of it's smart, now let's make it secure, we have the opportunity to do that in a manner that hasn't been done around the rest of the world and turn that into a positive market differentiation for 5G US. And I think that's the part we're really excited about, that this is an opportunity for the nation really to, while we weren't necessarily first to 5G everywhere, let's be first to secure 5G that has the kind of confidence required to bring out the venture capital, the community acceptance of the smart aspects of what the network can produce.
So is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners?
Wow, we've covered the waterfront here. I think the bottom line is we believe in 5G. We believe that there can be security in 5G. we need to do more than just admire the technology and the security challenges. We need to do something about it. And as Dave just eloquently said, and when we do something about it, it will create new domestic security and international opportunities that are important to American leadership.
Well, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare Materials supporter at patreon.com/lawfare. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfareblog.com. The podcast is edited by Jen Patja Howell, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thank you for listening.